We are absolutely delighted to have with us Arancha González. She's the United Nations Under-Secretary General and Executive Director of the International Trade Centre. Arancha will be in conversation in dialogue with Lord Stephen Green, Chairman of Asia House, who, as many of you know, was also the UK's Trade Minister. So we have fantastic expertise on trade, but we're taking a step back. Last week, Lord Green made a keynote address in Hong Kong, where he said that the world faces a challenge of cooperation in the face of mounting threats to the global commons. And he says, with each decision we make, the central focus has to be on sustainability if we are to be true to our responsibilities. At the ITC, Arancha's work has focused on good trade, sustainability, inclusivity, ensuring women's economic empowerment, and, of course, ensuring that trade is climate friendly. So with that introduction, I'd like to hand over to the final dialogue.
Thank you, Charlie. Thank you, Michael. And I'm going to rely on one of you two to tell us when we should stop. Otherwise, I suspect we will go on all afternoon. This is not an interview by myself of Arancha. This is a conversation. We had a little cup of coffee as to how we would orchestrate this, and the only thing we agreed on, the only specific thing that we agreed on was that I would start off, but it's not. But this is not. This is a conversation, and I am moved to start off with two thoughts. One is that about 100 years ago, when I was a very young, wet behind the ears McKinsey student, I was a student consultant. My very first assignment in McKinsey was with the International Trade Centre in Geneva. We had a little bit of a reminiscence over the cup of coffee as to the then Director General of the ITC, who was a Sri Lankan, and some of the things that we at McKinsey proposed. This is in the late 1970s, since when quite a lot of water has flowed under the bridge. And the other thing that that means that my path has sort of crossed with Arancha's one way or another is that when I was Trade Minister in the British coalition government, 2010 through 2013, in those wonderful days before anybody talked about Brexit, my very last week in office, I spent in Bali at the WTO ministerial, which was the meeting at which the WTO produced the only agreement that it's ever produced, the Trade Facilitation Agreement, which was subsequently ratified the following year, or I think it was 18 months later, and is now beginning to take effect, and whose benefits over the longer term in places particularly like landlocked African countries will be enormous. As it unlocks all of the frictions and difficulties of trading across borders in very basic ways and helps very poor African economies move up the value chain, increase their engagement with each other. And it was a powerful demonstration to me of the importance of the WTO. We've heard a certain amount in the course of this morning, and you hear it in the rhetoric, about whether the WTO is too cumbersome to be useful, whether it needs dismantling and starting again. You hear noises from President Trump, who clearly has a somewhat skeptical view of the WTO. I come away from that experience committed as committed as I've ever been to the importance of the work that the WTO does, and the recognition of the detailed, humdrum nature of that work, which makes so much difference. It's spade work, it's work in progress. We have to stick at it. Arancha.
Well, let me tell you that on this one, I'm 100% with you. But it's true. So we've got a big insurance policy called World Trade Organization. When things are bad, and the WTO serves us, we don't thank the WTO. It happened in 2008, 2009, when we had a huge financial crisis and countries did not engage in Vega Dinero protectionist measures. They decided to respect the rules they had given themselves in the World Trade Organization, but they didn't thank the WTO. They said, we were really smart. So I think it is important that we have the right diagnosis. The right diagnosis, I would say, starts by recognizing that the rules that we have are important to have. Of course, it's very important that the members respect those rules, and if they don't respect those rules, and we are seeing a lot of that lately, then the rules don't help. But then it's also that we have to make them better. We have to adjust, and we've got to upgrade them, and we haven't done that for a while. And the world has changed. And where is it that we've got to adapt them? And this is where I think, again, diagnostics matter a lot. Let me tell you what is for the WTO and what I see not in the WTO, but also needs fixing. And let me take the two big protagonists at the moment, US and China, but then let's look also at what others can do and they may not be doing. Let's look at China first. I think the big updates in the WTO rules that are necessary, given who China is today, not who China was 40 years ago, but who China is today, is the rules that ensure fair competition between the private part of the Chinese economy and the publicly owned part of the Chinese economy. It's not about asking China to give away state-owned enterprises. We are not asking any member of the World Trade Organization to give up state-owned enterprises. It's certainly not about asking China to do regime change in Beijing. This is not in the hands of the WTO. But it is about ensuring that the state-owned enterprises in China are competitively neutral vis-à-vis the private sector. That's the key consideration. Now, it's a key consideration first and foremost for China, because this is also an issue for China. China also has a privately owned sector that suffers from this, let's say, competition. But it also has a huge impact for the rest of the world, given the breathing that China has with the rest of the world. So what we should be focusing on is ensuring the competitive neutrality of China's public sector. And I just came here from Shanghai. What I heard President Xi Jinping say is, let companies in China operate under market forces, which in my view, it's pretty close to this sense of competitive neutrality. This is an area where the WTO can help, because the rules of WTO in this space are not good enough. They were made by the EU and the US at a time when it was them making the rules, but they had a state-owned sector that is slightly different from the one in China. That's a major area for WTO reform, one that, again, needs to be carried by someone. But let me now look at the other part of this equation. We don't look enough at what's happening in the US. And there is a big issue in the United States that cannot be solved by the WTO, which is how do they manage the huge technological transition that is happening in all our societies? How much do they invest in carrying their people along? If I look at what's happening in the world, a country like Denmark, where there is big support for international trade, spends around 2% of GDP, 2% of GDP in active labor market policies, meaning those who lose their jobs because of this big technological revolution, this new digitally powered economy, or because of the opening of their economy, they get support to go back into the labor market. They get training, they can be retrained. There is a compact between business and government that this has to be done in a collaborative manner. Germany, and we have Anna Ruth here, spends around 1.2% of GDP in that. In the US, it's 0.1% of GDP that is spent on active labor market policies. And this is a huge drag for the ability to build bipartisan support in Washington for open trade policies. Now, again, this is not for the WTO to solve. This is for America. They've got to solve this. But if they don't address this, and we are not focusing enough attention there, political support for open markets will gradually erode. And of course, the easy bit when you're confronted with this is to try and look for culprits elsewhere.
Which leads me to pick up on something that Minister Swaran said this morning. I think there was a profoundly important point there, that you cannot place upon trade and foreign investment policy the whole burden of restructuring the domestic imbalances of an economy. This goes for China, goes for America, it goes for Britain, by the way. You very kindly didn't mention the difficulties of the British economy at the moment. But in all those three cases, you've got obvious examples of unbalanced domestic economies. In the case of China, too much investment, too much savings, too little consumption, and an economy, therefore, which is building up, or has been until relatively recently, massive central reserves and a massive trade imbalance, I should say. Conversely, the US with too much consumption, too little savings, too little investment, and what you've described as one particularly important manifestation of a more general problem of too little investment in its broadest sense in the US economy. So that's imbalanced in a mirror image of the Chinese economy. And you cannot rely on trade policy to sort out those imbalances. In both cases, what you're pointing to, and I agree completely, is the need for domestic reform. Domestic reform in the US by way of infrastructure investment and people investment, and you have pointed out to the profound importance of the people investment. You described that in terms of of retaining political support for the open economy. An economist could put it in economic terms of continuing to benefit properly from the development of human capital, would be another way of putting the same thing. If I look at my own country, the UK, what the Brexit vote exposed was a huge gulf between the prosperous, developing, open, flexible southeast of the economy, in simple terms, and a much more ossified, less well invested, both in human capital and also in physical capital, rest of the economy. And so you got this 50-50 split that we still live with and suffer from. And again, the imbalances show up in the trade account. Britain has, I think I'm right in saying, the largest trade deficit in the whole of Europe. And that's a sign of that imbalance. But once again, the trade is important, absolutely important, but it cannot do the job of reforming the domestic economy. So what you were saying and what Minister Swaran was saying this morning, I think is a profoundly important theme for us to take away, because it complicates life. It says that trade itself is complicated enough, as the detailed, painstaking work of the WTO demonstrates, and as the painstaking work of negotiating free trade agreements between the EU and Japan, between around the region, the whole question of what a post-Brexit Britain will do in trade agreements. All of this is painstaking, difficult work. And on top of that, we're saying there's a desperate need for domestic economic reform. So life is complicated.
Life is complicated, but hey, we live in a complicated world. Now, what I also wanted to say is that not everything, again, to go back to the beginning of this conversation, not everything in the World Trade Organization is broken, and there are areas where there are discussions also between the US and China ongoing. There is a negotiation at the moment ongoing in WTO called electronic commerce. It sounds very obscure. US is part of that. China is part of that. The EU is part of that. We haven't spoken about the EU yet, but I'm sure we'll get to that. Japan is there, Korea is there, Canada is there. There are about 90 countries on electronic commerce. Now, this discussion on electronic commerce is not just about electronic commerce. In reality, the big discussion there is one theme that we've been hearing all morning here, which is data. Where will the data sit? Who will have the data? Who will own it? How will we protect it? How will we ensure that different regulatory approaches can be made interoperable? Meaning that if you decide to protect your citizens' privacy, which at the end of the day is a value also that is important in some constituencies, this does not mean that you fragment the level playing field, but you find some sort of interoperability between that and leaving it all to the market. So this is happening also in the World Trade Organization. And by the way, Singapore is a huge advocate and is pushing a lot in this conversation. An area, again, which is not going to be easy, but which shows that the countries that are involved in this discussion value the idea that there is a global level playing field. Because the alternative world that we've been toying with this last month of, if technology is an issue for the supremacy in the 21st century, I'll do my technology, you do your technology. This would mean fragmenting the level playing field with huge consequences, as we are seeing for businesses all across the world, in particular for this region that has invested enormously in building regional value chains whose basic tenet is based on a global level playing field.
Huge consequences not only economically but also socially, of course, if you disengage data in the sorts of way that some of us have speculated on, and both this morning and again in the general sort of media commentary. I think the notion that you might end up with a decoupling of an Asian bloc led by China and a Western bloc led by the US is profoundly dangerous for humanity, quite apart from its impact on trade flows and investment. The question is, I suppose, to ask, to put it in the way that Lenin did, what is to be done? And one of the my first answer to that question is there is no magic wand. There is no simple measure to take away the trade nervousness, and we've seen it, just recently. We were talking about earlier about the regional ARCEP and the Indian refusal to participate in that. That reminded me of the very difficult discussions in Bali that I referred to earlier, which resulted in the trade facilitation agreement in the end, but very nearly didn't result in a trade facilitation agreement because of the opposition of two countries who were nervous about its impact on them, and one of them was India. So I'm tempted to use that famous French phrase, plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. And getting India drawn into and prepared for the challenges of international trade engagement is still one of the big tasks of our collective effort in our time. India is far too big an economy and a society to leave out, whether by its own choice or by collective exclusion because it's too difficult to deal with, from all of this progress. So part of my answer is we have to keep talking to the Indian government and to Indian points of influence about re-engaging them in regional trade possibilities and indeed in active, dare I say, responsible support for the WTO and its future. Thirdly, there are clearly work to be done on the strengthening of the WTO. Arancha, you've just alluded to that. You are far more expert in that than I am, so I wouldn't dare to get very specific about what that is. But we want a WTO which has strong arbitration, strong dispute resolution, authoritative, so that the countries around the world respect its decisions and abide by them, and then a far-seeing sense that in many ways the big challenge for the next many decades actually is going to be, is a shared challenge, is the development of Africa. For all sorts of reasons, we want to see much more rapid African growth, which involves much more trade and investment, which means African entrepreneurs moving up the value chain. And at the moment, looking backwards, that's been difficult because of intra-African trade, has been difficult because of all sorts of ridiculous barriers. It's also been difficult, you mentioned the EU, because of the nature of the EU economic partnership agreements, which sort of condemn African businesses not to not exporting, but to exporting at the bottom end of the value chain. And we need, as Europeans, the courage to open up African trade in a way that allows them to move up the value chain. So lots of stuff to do. What do you think?
So I think the question now for all these countries that are neither the US nor China is what to do. Now, I think they are made to believe that they've got to choose between China and the US. The US would tell them, listen, if you choose China, then you're against me. And the US would say, well, if you choose China, you're going to be against. So they feel a bit uncomfortable, and I understand that they are a bit hesitant. But I just think that this is not, for those that are in the middle, this is not a choice between the US or China. Nobody can afford to choose between the US and China today. I think the right way to put this is the choice is between order or chaos. Now, the problem is that all these countries cannot thrive in chaos. They may feel that they can gain a bit of an advantage here and there, a value chain can come here if it leaves China, but that's temporarily. Long term, you cannot, if we are in a much more geopolitical world, these countries cannot thrive in chaos. This is why they have to invest in order. Order, so, inverted commas, please. And this order is building rules, painfully building the set of rules that will protect them against these very unilateral policies that we are seeing today, which, by the way, we are seeing don't work. But in a much more geopolitical world, sometimes the noise hides this inefficient way in which unilateralism works. So what can these countries in the middle do? What can Europe, what can ASEAN, what can Japan, what can Africa do? I think what they can do is, first of all, activate a little bit more their resources and activate a little bit more their ability to craft agreements. And they do have an ability to craft agreements at the global level or at the regional level. We've seen how Japan took leadership in the CPTPP, and CPTPP came to being. We have seen now how Singapore has taken a bit of a lead on RCEP, and RCEP has come to being. We have seen how Rwanda has taken a big leadership in Africa to construct a continental free trade agreement in Africa, and it's happening. So there is a space also to leverage a little bit better and a little bit more this middle. Now, in this middle, obviously, Europe has a big role to play, not on its own, not big enough, with others, yes. It's just that Europe's brand in this more geopolitical world is slightly different from China or the US brand. And here is where I think for Europe, the smart thing is to combine the three things that Europe knows to do well, but to combine them more intelligently. Its ability to do trade, because this is an area where they've got an exclusive competence where Europe is Europe. Its development portfolio, another one where Europe is Europe, and at the end of the day is the biggest provider of development support, not just money, but also investments. And the third one, it's regulatory capacity, where again, Europe is Europe. If it combines intelligently these three, it can provide a bit of an alternative pole to generate political energy to try and build a bit more, let's say, common sense to this discussion on international trade that at the end of the day is in the interest of every member of the international community.